Although it kind of did before the foundation of the earth, right? So we've been talking for a number of weeks, previous to last week, about how to be blessed people and give that blessing away, okay? So we use the word bless as an acronym. So B standing for begin with prayer, L, listen with care, E, eat together, S, serve, and a lot of people kind of stop bless right there. But you have to spell bless with two S's, and the final S is share your story. This has all been given to be passed on, all right? And this is really what we're talking about. That's what the New Testament calls the Great Commission. We are commissioned, we are in mission to go do that. Just like the missionaries up here, we can put any of your faces any week. You're going to be sent someplace. I'm telling you, you're sent whether you give the word, whether you give the greeting, whether you drive like a Christian or not, you've been sent to do that. Okay? So that's part of it. Now the other part of it that makes the Great Commission work is the Great Commandment. And the Great Commandment is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, and our neighbor, and this is really key, a lot of people miss this, as ourselves. We're going to take some time this morning to break that out, but the as ourselves is real important. Can't love God. Can't love neighbor until we love ourselves. We talked about that last week. And I know that sounds perilous. It sounds like, well, how could that be? I mean, that sounds even selfish, but that's false humility. We'll talk a little bit about that. But we started with as ourselves last week. I'm going to back us into that again this week because it's so important. But we're really focusing on loving our neighbors. Now, the passage is central or centralized to this question. Who is my neighbor? Like, who is my neighbor? Is my neighbor some of those folks in our family that we have to invite over this week, and they're not my neighbor, but we, or what, if they mess up this year like they did last year, they're certainly going to get fired as being neighbors and family. So it's a question. Who is my neighbor? And so I want to ask this, why do we ask questions? What is it about questions that cause us to want to share that? Okay? So the obvious is we need information. So you pull over and you say, how do I find Good Samaritan Church? And someone downtown, gives you directions. So we get information or we make a point. Often, we're trying to make a point with our questions, right? Questions sometimes confirm our assumptions, our thinking, even our judgments, and our suspicions. Think about that. So when you're disappointed because a friend didn't show up at an appointment, you text them. Didn't you get my text? Right? You see? So we're making a point, but we're asking a question. Or maybe the person does show up at the appointment, and they're just kind of in our face, and we're kind of, so the question is, why are you so keyed up? You see? Because we're backing away a little bit. We're a little bit defensive. So I'm just going to go with the question theme this morning. I just want to stay with that and just draw you in. Familiar passage, got to do something new. Hopefully see something in a new way. Because our morning question, who is my neighbor, really is asking us three important questions. And the first is this: what is or why is this question so important? Why is the lawyer, this Pharisee, saying, who is my neighbor? Why is that important? Well, it's important for two reasons. It reveals his motive. And I might add for us this morning, questions reveal our motives as well. Look at verse 25 with me. And on one occasion, an expert in the law, some would say a Pharisee, stood up to test Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but in school, test day was always like, ugh. Now, if I had studied, it would have been helpful. But that just was, I didn't have time to study in school. I was doing other important things, okay? So tests aren't necessarily bad, unless, we've all done this, so I'll just include you in it. Unless you're giving somebody a test and they don't know it. Like you're throwing something out there and you're testing their sincerity. I wonder if they're going to. Not a good test, okay? That's only going to confirm any suspicions that you started with. This is what the Pharisee is doing. He comes with a question to test Jesus, and Jesus is so cool. Because he has a way of taking our test and flipping it over. So the lawyer says, and you're familiar with this, "So, Rabbi, you're the great rabbi. If we were going to boil down the whole Old Testament, what would it be?" And Jesus wisely strokes his beard. You can almost see this happening. And he says to the lawyer, and lawyer, any lawyers here today? Ron's not. He's first. He's stroking his beard, as Jesus is stroking his beard. And Jesus says to the lawyer, "Well, what do you think?" He can't pass it up. He bites. Oh, Jesus has asked me to answer the question. So he just jumps right in and says, "Well, Lord, the law would be summed up in this. It would start in Deuteronomy, in the Shema." We're going to look at that next week when we get to the last piece of this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor. And then he goes, and then I would take it to Leviticus, and then your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Exactly!" And he's all proud of himself. And then Jesus says, "Now go do that." That's not what he wanted, right? He wanted to have a little theological tete-a-tete. He didn't want to actually talk about life. He just wanted to get to the answers, you see. So his motive in verse 29 is to justify himself. In verse 25, it's to test Jesus. But so now Jesus' response to the man also reveals the focus that the man had. The man was looking for requirement. For most of us, requirement is, how much does it take? And for this guy, requirement is, how little can I do? And squeak in and get in the door. What's the minimum requirement that gets me inside? And you see, the guy's in a bit of a pickle, isn't he? Because now that he's given the answer, but he's not willing to do what Jesus told him to do, he says, "Well, who's my neighbor then?" You see, you're going to be a lawyer type. You've got to have a backup question. You can't get trapped by the first question. In fact, if you're talking to Jesus, you better have a lot of backup questions. Because he's going to get you at each go. And so, busted, ouch, caught, he realizes not only that he knows the answer, but he's not familiar with the language that it's going to take. He's in that place of saying, you know, I really want to know the exactitude of the bus fare, what's it cost, instead of how to live fare. I checked this out with Gail last night. Those two fares are spelled differently. Right? Sometimes all we want is bus fare, spare change. Jesus is talking about live fare, spare a life, give hope. So, that's why this question is important. What is Jesus teaching here? Well, in order for Jesus to say something really significant, and I love this about Jesus because, like I said, didn't do a lot in school, but I love stories. You know, I finally had to teach myself how to read as a sophomore and junior in high school, so everyone was reading cool stories. So I wanted to do that. People were starting to read their Bible, and I wanted to do that. So Jesus tells this awesome story. You all know it. In fact, our church is named for it. If you hadn't gotten so used to it, you'd look up as you go out these doors, and you'd see the whole story of the Good Samaritan right up there, almost in the ceiling. And then if you go out the doors and look up, you're going to see the last words. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The last words of the story. So the story is this. It's a story in which a sworn enemy of Israel, a Samaritan, an ignorant, ill-informed, sinful Samaritan, not only knows the law, but he does the law better than the Pharisee. Well, this is super gotcha story. The guy who's the bad news guy, the outsider, outside the club, he gets it. Because the religious guys walked by the accident. You know? The religious guys drove by really fast when the migrant truck was pulled over and they were trying to figure something out. The Samaritan pulls over and says, I got a tire. I got you. I get it. Well, now our teacher is shrinking by the moment. And I would just say that in our culture today, just as in their culture then, there is a moral compass that we've been given, and we will now decide by our actions whether we will follow that moral compass or we will follow the path that leads to our desired outcome. Yeah, ouch. You see, we'll either do what's right or we'll do what the club expects. And so here we are. So with that in mind, there are two kinds of neighbors. And our first passage, Leviticus 19:18, shares the first neighbor. Let me talk about that a bit. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge, or as I said last week, or even a little grudgelet. No grudge, no grudge light against your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I just want to talk about that a little bit. So there's no revenge, no grudge, no grudgelet, no grudge, 0 calorie. Now let me just take you back 7 days. Many of you were sitting here last week. That's when I reminded you, and we all heard it for the first time, that if you are dishonest to yourself, if you are unloving with yourself, if you cannot forgive yourself, then you will be dishonest with others, you will not love them, and you will not forgive them. This is how we are made. I hear people, oh no, it's all about everyone else and God, but me, I'm so lowly. It doesn't work like that. It can't work like that. God says, as yourself. That's the intro to this lesson, which is the intro to loving God next week. Notice that the priority is loving God, not loving yourself. But you can only get there by starting at the bottom of the mountain. You don't get to the top of Mount Everest by just, I've arrived, and you put your flag there. You start way, way down there in order to get up there. So I just reminding you that this sense of ourselves is reflected in how we treat those around us, and ultimately how we treat those around us reflects on who we are, and ultimately reflects on who God is. But it's the second. It's the second neighbor, and this is what I call, right out of the text, the alien neighbor. So I just want to say, But wait! The Saturday afternoon infomercial. But wait! There's more! Okay? And there's more than one neighbor. For $19.95, we'll send you 2 neighbors plus shipping and handling. Okay? And the second neighbor happens to be the alien. Read this and buckle your seatbelt. When an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Remember? We're confronted. Moral compass? Or where my groups go. Love him as yourself. For you, and 2 reasons. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt. And the reason number 2, I'm the Lord God. I have reason enough right there. Let's go to the first reason. You see, we're all pretty good at rehearsing what everyone's done to us. And therefore, we're coming up with the second act. We've left the moral compass. And we've started acting upon what someone else did. But wasn't our time, your time, in whatever your Egypt is, wasn't that bad? Why would we reciprocate as the moral people of God? Why would we stoop to the behavior that we hated in another? Why would we treat, well, but Pastor, don't talk to me. Talk to the Lord God. Think about this. And all the stuff that we drag around are great memories of Egypt and how we were offended and hurt there. Isn't the goal to break the chains? Or are we going to tighten the chains and get everyone in the room with us? Or are we going to step loose and find ourselves in a new place? You see, the mistreatment of someone who is deeply, deeply hurt. Read a story this week about a guy whose daughter was murdered. And has pursued all the attempts to get justice. And it just was not forthcoming. So his final resolution is, I'm going to get the guy who got hurt. And all of a sudden, through that divisive lens that Satan uses, turns that person who has true grief and love for a daughter into a criminal. At least in his own heart. Jesus says, if you ill wish to somebody and they don't even know it, somehow they have a higher superiority without taking on the true moral compass. Okay, so how do we do this? This is you know, we have to spend some time here. This is tough stuff. Every single person in the room has history. And we think, maybe that's the problem. So we should stop thinking. Start listening, observe, and then do something radical that would break the chain. Whatever God, you could be at a place where you're so exhausted with it that you would say, let's try God. You've heard the story of the family in the hospital, and the doctor looks at him and says, we've done everything we can. It's your best hope is prayer. And someone in the family says, has it come to that? Wow. So quickly we find ourselves in that same situation. How do we do this? Let me make several things clear, and then going to look at some things that we could do. Let's be very clear that we can't love to be loved. Okay? You can't pick someone out and love them, and then they have to love you. That's not how it works. God's loving a lot of people that are choosing to spurn the love of God. And sometimes they be us. Okay? Let's be clear with that. That loving someone so that they would love us. So after all of our love for this individual, we say, and then they treat us like that. Did we actually love someone all that time so we could stand up at the end of days and say, and then they treated me like that? Or did we love them? Regardless. The second piece of clarity here, none of this is in your notes, but it's really good stuff, so I'd be writing it down. Number 2 is we can't forgive to be forgiven. It doesn't work. You either forgive or you don't. Well, I forgave them. You're not in it with them. You're in it with you and God. You want to break that chain of whatever puts you in it on the wrong side of the bars with the gorilla. I don't want to be on the wrong side of the bars with the gorilla. I want to be out. God wants you out of that. You visit the zoo. You don't live there. Okay? And then number 3, we can't give to give. You hear me say that all the time. We can't give to give. We love or we do not love. We're faced with the moral compass that says, am I doing something to further the way I think the world should be at cost of losing the moral compass that says, I want my people to do what I want them to do. This was tested in the early church. You've seen pictures of the Colosseum in Rome. Well, they weren't there, sorry Joe, they weren't there to see the Raiders, okay? You know what I mean? And it wasn't that Colosseum, okay? They were ringing the Colosseum to be let into the Colosseum to be eaten by animals. And you know what they were doing in line? They were singing. I hate that. I mean, they were so giving themselves to God. This was tested in the early centuries. It's being tested today. We're going to have picks and non-picks, and I'm on this team but not on that team. You see, if you love with expectations that love's going to come back to you, it's just a loan with interest. You're giving the people that you say you love a loan with interest. Or it's just a service that you're asking for full payment at some point in your life. You owe me. I loved you. Okay. Now that you know all that, 3 things I want you to know. And this is in the notes, so you got it to go. First is, remember God's mercy for you. And I will just remind you that God's mercy for everyone in the room is full and complete. It's all done. Nothing was left out. God isn't going to show you the fine print and say, oh, no, Mr. Jeff. Not that one. That's not on the list. It's full and complete. God's mercy to me is full and complete. Next, acknowledge God's mercy for others. God's mercy for others is as full and complete as God's mercy for you. For God so loved the world, that means everyone, that Jesus died on the cross for everyone. Not like a will call thing, you got to pick up your ticket, you got to go to the concert. But nevertheless, it's been done for us as much as it's been done for anyone else in the world, in particular, those people that are difficult for you to get that right. That's step 1. Next, finally, apply God's mercy to myself and others. Again, going back to last week, apply God's mercy to yourself and see it, take it, sit down, think about God's tremendous mercy. Do you want God's mercy to be full and free to the people that you really love, that are hard to love? When you start answering that in the affirmative, something will happen. Some would say that the modern translation of 1 Corinthians 13 would sound something like this. Love bears some things. Love believes only the best things, and I decide. Love hopes for a reasonable period of time, then we kick the bums out. Love endures for a while. That is pretty crazy. Yeah, you got it going there. I love that. So here's what it says. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. That's the definition of love. Now, I'm going to tell you, almost before you get out these doors and can look at the picture of the Good Samaritan, and certainly as you're going out these doors and it says, go and do likewise, this is what's going to happen to everyone in the room. And I'm just telling you now, so you get it. If you feel you really love someone, especially, and they are difficult, and you decide as you're sitting in these seats to take another go with them, to let them know it, to say the bygone is the past is the past. I get it. Pastor Jeff's just parroting what Jesus says. That should have been an easy sermon to come up with. It's just all good God stuff. I'm on board. If you say that this morning, the next voice you will hear is the voice of Satan, who will show you every reason to quit on that commitment. Just telling you, before you get your key in the car out there, friends. And then, if you're still listening, or you didn't take your key across someone's paint job, because it's real, so, oh my, real persecution in America, so keep my car. If you're still listening, you'll hear this, folks. Then God will say, love them like I've loved you all of your life, and I've never, ever quit on you, and I never will. Jesus in Luke 6 says, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Boy, let's get real generous now. Love is love as God has defined it in your and my life. And here's how God has defined it. Giving love, forgiveness, grace, mercy, provision, and blessing. Each of us have sensed that. Jesus tells us it's on the door on the way out. I'm going to encourage you. Go and do likewise. Be set free. Push restart today. In Jesus' name. Lord, we thank you.